September 25, 1986. 5:45 a.m. Jalalabad airfield, eastern Afghanistan. Captain Nikolai Gerasimov ran through the pre-flight brief for his flight of 4 Mi-24s. Standard sweep of the Panjshir approach, villages along the river, known Mujaheddin supply routes, back to base by noon. He'd flown this corridor 31 times. The brief took 6 minutes. Nobody asked questions. The Hind crews at Jalalabad operated with a kind of bored invincibility by late '86. They had reason to. The Mi-24 carried titanium belly armor, redundant hydraulic lines, infrared exhaust suppressors. Afghan rebels had been shooting at them for 7 years with heavy machine guns, RPG-7s, the occasional SA-7 Grail shoulder missile. The Grail needed a hot exhaust signature and a cooperative target geometry to lock. Hind pilots learned to pop flares on egress and fly nap-of-the-earth profiles that gave the SA-7's seeker head fits. Losses happened, but they stayed manageable. A Soviet after-action assessment from August of '86 described the rebel anti-aircraft threat as degraded and locally contained. Their words. The assessment had a shelf life of about 3 hours. What Gerasimov didn't know, what nobody at Jalalabad knew yet, involved a weapon that had arrived in country roughly 5 weeks earlier through Pakistani intelligence channels, packed in unmarked crates, distributed to hand-picked teams who'd trained on it at secret camps outside Rawalpindi. The FIM-92 Stinger, a 10-kilogram tube that an illiterate goat herd could learn to operate in a weekend. Infrared-ultraviolet dual-band seeker, lead bias proportional navigation. It didn't chase the exhaust plume like the Grail. It tracked the airframe itself. The Stinger changed the math in a way Soviet aviation planners hadn't modeled because they didn't know it existed in the theater. CIA had fought a brutal internal battle over whether to send them at all. The worry centered on technology transfer, a Stinger falling into Soviet hands for reverse engineering. Congressman Charlie Wilson pushed for it, and the agency's Gust Avrakotos lobbied even more aggressively. The decision came from the top, and by August of '86, the first units crossed into Afghanistan carried on the backs of mules. This story doesn't get told straight very often. The politics, the technology, the Soviet side of it, all together. If that's the kind of history you want, hit subscribe. Drop a like if you're already here for this. And if you know something I missed, the comments exist for a reason. Back at Jalalabad, Gerasimov's flight lifted off into pale light over the valley. 4 Hinds in staggered trail. Nose guns traversing, rocket pods loaded. They climbed to 300 feet and turned northeast toward the Panjshir. Somewhere below them, in terrain so broken it swallowed whole battalions, a 3-man team under Commander Ghaffar knelt beside a dry stream bed. One of them carried a tube he'd fired exactly twice in training. The flight log from Jalalabad lists 4 helicopters departing that morning. It lists 3 returning. 3 Hinds came back. The 4th burned in a ravine southeast of the river fork, its crew dead before the wreckage stopped sliding. But to understand why that single shoot-down mattered, why it sent a shockwave through Soviet command structures from Kabul to Moscow, you need to see what the 40th Army had built in Afghanistan over 7 years. Because it worked. It worked extremely well. Soviet close air support doctrine in Afghanistan evolved through trial and error into something lethal. The first year, 1979 into '80, helicopters flew too high and hit nothing. Pilots trained for European tank warfare had no framework for engaging dispersed fighters in vertical terrain. They adjusted. By '82, the standard Mi-24 attack profile dropped to 50 meters above ground level, sometimes lower. Pilots learned to use ridgelines as cover, pop over a crest, ripple-fire S-8 rockets into a valley, and bank away before ground fire could track them. The Hind's chin-mounted 12.7mm Gatling gun could suppress a hillside in 4 seconds of sustained burst. Then the Su-25 arrived. The Frogfoot entered Afghan service in 1981 for operational evaluation and never left. Titanium-armored cockpit tub, 10 hardpoints, built specifically for the close support mission the Americans had designed the A-10 for. Soviet pilots flew it at 400 knots through valleys so narrow the wingtips cleared rock faces by meters. They dropped FAB-500 general-purpose bombs, cluster munitions, napalm canisters. A single Su-25 sortie against a Mujaheddin column in Kunar province in March of '84 destroyed 14 vehicles and killed an estimated 60 fighters in under 90 seconds. The Mujaheddin called Mi-24's Shaitan Arba, Satan's chariot. They called the Su-25's Rook after the chess piece because they moved in straight, devastating lines. Through most of the war, the rebels fought back with almost nothing. DSHK heavy machine guns, effective to about 1,500 meters against a crossing target, nearly useless against a head-on attack run. ZGU-1 anti-aircraft guns, sparse and hard to move. And the SA-7 Grail, which the Soviets understood intimately because they'd designed it. Soviet countermeasures against the Grail bordered on contemptuous. Pop 2 flares, done. A strange detail that has nothing to do with the main thread but irritates me more than it should. The CIA spent nearly 2 years trying to source non-American weapons for the Mujaheddin, buying up Oerlikon cannons and old British blowpipe missiles through third-party cutouts, and the blowpipe's hit rate in Afghan hands hovered around something like 3%. 3%. The British Army's own troops had barely managed better in the Falklands 4 years earlier. Millions of dollars spent on a weapon that required the operator to manually guide it onto target using a tiny thumb joystick while standing upright in a combat zone. Which brings us back to why the Stinger decision carried so much weight. Everything else had already failed. Between '82 and '86, Soviet aviation losses to ground fire averaged roughly 1 aircraft per week. Sustainable. Replaceable. The 40th Army's air component flew over 200,000 sorties in that window. A Soviet General Staff assessment from early '86, the document uses the phrase complete air dominance over the operational theater. Complete. Not partial, not local. Complete. Ground commanders built their entire tactical approach around it. Convoy ambushed in a mountain pass, call in the Hinds. Village harboring a rebel commander, Su-25s flatten it before the infantry walks in. The air arm functioned as the 40th Army's skeleton. Remove it and everything collapses. Bones without muscle can still stand. Muscle without bones cannot. Soviet pilots knew this, felt it in the deference ground. Officers showed them at mess. In the priority, their maintenance requests received. They owned the airspace over Afghanistan the way a landlord owns a building. Gaffar's team, in that streambed, held the eviction notice. $250 million. That's what CIA funneled into Operation Cyclone by 1984, making it the largest covert action program since Vietnam. Saudi Arabia matched it dollar for dollar. $500 million annually pouring into Afghanistan through Pakistan's ISI, and Soviet helicopters still owned every valley from Kandahar to Badakhshan. The money bought Kalashnikovs, RPGs, landmines, medical kits, mule trains. It bought the blowpipes and the Oerlikons. It bought a war of attrition that bled the Soviets without breaking them. CIA station chiefs in Islamabad sent cable after cable back to Langley describing the same problem. Rebel ground forces could ambush convoys, mine roads, assassinate collaborators, but they could not hold terrain because the moment they concentrated, the Hinds came. Gust Avrakotos understood this before most of his colleagues at Langley. A blue-collar Greek-American case officer with a profane streak that made him enemies in the Directorate of Operations, Avrakotos ran the Afghan task force and spent 1985 pushing for the one weapon he believed could alter the equation. The Stinger. His superiors pushed back hard. The objections came from reasonable people making reasonable arguments. The Stinger contained classified seeker technology. If the Soviets recovered one intact, and they would try General Dynamics Rosette scan pattern and the IFF transponder codes, could end up in a laboratory outside Moscow within weeks. The Counterintelligence Division estimated a 70% probability of at least one missile falling into hostile hands within the first year of deployment. A separate concern involved escalation. Handing American-made weapons to Afghan guerrillas dropped any pretense of deniability. The Kremlin would know exactly who supplied them. The serial numbers alone told the story. An odd footnote here. The State Department briefly floated the idea of buying Soviet-made SA-14 Gremlins on the black market to preserve deniability. They apparently located a potential supplier in Egypt, then discovered the units available had degraded propellant charges and corroded battery coolant assemblies. Shelf life problems on stolen Soviet ordnance. I find this fascinating but cannot explain why. The idea that the whole Stinger debate might have been avoided if Egyptian arms dealers maintained better warehouse conditions. Anyway, back to Langley. The internal fight reached the National Security Council in the spring of '86. National Security Advisor John Poindexter sided with the Hawks. President Reagan signed the authorization. A CIA logistics report from June of that year describes the first shipment as 240 units, broken into batches of 40, routed through Karachi, and then overland to Ojri camp near Rawalpindi. The smell of cordite and burnt propellant hung over those training ranges for weeks. Pakistani instructors drilled Mujaheddin teams on target acquisition, IFF bypass procedures, lead angles for crossing targets. Each team fired one live round, some fired two. Then they walked into Afghanistan carrying a weapon the Soviets didn't know existed in the theater. The Stinger didn't just outperform the SA-7, it operated on different principles entirely. Look at what the SA-7 Grail actually did. Its seeker head used a single-band, uncooled infrared detector tuned to the hot exhaust gases of a jet or turboshaft engine. To get a lock, the operator needed to point the tube at the target's tailpipe, a rear aspect shot, essentially chasing the aircraft. The seeker followed the hottest point in its field of view. Drop a magnesium flare at 2,000 degrees, and the missile abandoned the aircraft to chase the flare every single time. Soviet pilots understood this vulnerability because Soviet engineers had built it in as an acceptable trade-off. The Grail cost about $5,000 a unit, disposable, a volume weapon for conscript armies. The FIM-92 Stinger used a cooled indium antimonide detector operating across two spectral bands, infrared and ultraviolet simultaneously. The dual-band seeker compared the IR signature of a target against its UV profile. A flare burns extremely hot in infrared, but produces a different UV signature than a turbine engine's exhaust plume mixed with atmospheric scatter. The Stinger's onboard processor, analog not digital, which surprises people, performed this comparison continuously and rejected decoys that didn't match both bands. The processor itself is worth pausing on. General Dynamics engineers at Pomona, California, built what they called a rosette scan pattern into the seeker. Instead of staring at a fixed point, the detector element traced a flower petal pattern across the target, sampling the background and the heat source dozens of times per second. This gave the missile something close to spatial awareness. It could distinguish a point source, like a flare, from a distributed source, like an engine nacelle. The SA-7 stared. The Stinger scanned. Then there's the engagement geometry. The Grail required rear aspect. The Stinger offered all aspect capability. Front, side, rear, climbing, diving, crossing. An Mi-24 flying directly toward a Stinger team at 50 meters altitude was a viable shot. So was an Su-25 making a head-on gun run at 400 knots, or a transport helicopter hovering over a landing zone 3 kilometers away. Soviet tactical doctrine assumed ground-launched missiles came from behind. Pilots planned their ingress routes accordingly, attacked nose-on when possible, saved their flares for the egress turn when they exposed their exhaust. The Stinger made all of that irrelevant. The engagement sequence took roughly 10 seconds. Operator activates the battery coolant unit, a small argon bottle that chills the seeker to operating temperature. Shoulders the weapon. Aims through an open sight. The IFF antenna interrogates the target automatically, determines friend or foe, and provides an audible tone. When the seeker achieves lock, the tone shifts from intermittent to steady. Operator applies lead using a simple range ring, presses the trigger. The ejector motor kicks the missile out of the tube. At about 8 meters of flight, the solid fuel sustainer ignites and accelerates the missile to roughly Mach 2. A CIA training assessment from Rawalpindi noted that Mujaheddin operators achieved reliable target acquisition within 6 to 9 seconds of visual contact. The report calls the system remarkably intuitive for users with no prior technical background. Soviet countermeasures circa 86 addressed none of this. Their flare dispensers carried 32 magnesium cartridges calibrated to defeat single-band IR seekers. Their exhaust suppressors reduced thermal signature in the specific wavelength the SA-7 tracked. Their evasive maneuver doctrine assumed a tail-chase missile with limited off-bore sight capability. Every layer of defense the 40th Army's aviation branch had built over 7 years targeted a threat profile the Stinger did not match. The kill envelope told the rest of the story. Effective range out to approximately 4,800 meters. Effective altitude ceiling around 3,800 meters. A Hind, flying its standard 50-meter attack profile, sat inside that envelope for nearly its entire mission duration. And Su-25, pulling up from a bomb run, climbed directly through the heart of it. Soviet pilots continued flying those profiles through September of '86 because nobody told them to stop. The intelligence chain between Kabul and Moscow moved at the speed of bureaucracy. Ghafar's team moved at the speed of a man walking through mountains with a tube on his back. The river smelled like diesel and mud. Ghafar's team had been in the streambed since before dawn. 5 men crouched among rocks, still cold from the night. 3 Stinger tubes propped against boulders, wrapped in blankets to keep dust off the seeker windows. They knew the flight schedule because everyone in Nangarhar province knew the flight schedule. Soviet helicopters launched from Jalalabad airfield at predictable intervals. Early morning for route clearance, midday for resupply runs, late afternoon for extraction. The 40th Army's aviation planners didn't vary their timing because they'd never needed to. 7 years of air dominance had made them lazy. Ghafar's team sat roughly 8 kilometers southeast of the airfield, positioned along a corridor the Hinds used to transit toward operations in the Spingar foothills. The spot offered elevation and clear sightlines across 2 kilometers of valley floor. But what mattered most was a withdrawal route into broken terrain where helicopters couldn't follow. The formation appeared low on the horizon just after 6 a.m., 4 Mi-24. D models in staggered trail, flying at what Afghan witnesses later estimated as 60 to 80 meters altitude. Standard profile. Standard spacing. Ghafar activated the battery coolant unit on the first tube. The argon hissed. The seeker tone came through the earpiece, warbling, searching, then a hard, steady whine as it locked onto the lead aircraft's engine signature at approximately 3,000 meters. He applied lead, pressed the trigger, and the ejector charge thumped the missile clear of the tube, with a sound one team member later compared to someone kicking a wooden door. The sustainer lit and the missile covered the distance in under 4 seconds. It struck the lead Hind near the engine exhaust assembly. The helicopter pitched nose down, rolled left, and hit the valley floor, trailing a column of black kerosene smoke that Ghafar could smell from the streambed within minutes. The remaining 3 Hinds broke formation. 2 banked, hard right, 1 climbed and began popping flares, 32 magnesium cartridges cycling into empty air, defeating a threat that no longer existed in this war. Ghafar shouldered a second tube, locked, fired. The second Hind took the missile somewhere along the tail boom and auto-rotated into a field, burning. The third missile caught the climbing helicopter as it turned through its flare pattern. It fell almost vertically. The 4th Hind ran. Full power, nose down, back toward Jalalabad. 3 shots, 3 kills. The engagement lasted under 90 seconds. A CIA after-action cable transmitted to Langley that evening describes the results with unusual brevity. 3 of 3 engagements resulted in confirmed kills with FIM-92. No friendly casualties. All team members extracted successfully. Avrakotos reportedly read the cable twice. Colonel General Viktor Afanasyev grounded every helicopter in Nangarhar province for 72 hours. The order came down on September 26th one day after Ghafar's ambush, and it spread across the 40th Army's aviation units like a virus. Pilots, who'd flown 3 sorties a day for months, sat in ready rooms playing cards, waiting for guidance that didn't come. When flying resumed, the new directive read like a surrender document dressed in military language. Minimum operating altitude: 4,000 meters. No helicopter operations below 3,800 meters without dedicated fighter escort. Flare expenditure doubled per sortie. Approach patterns to forward bases changed from direct descent to high-altitude spiral, corkscrewing down inside the perimeter of friendly air defense coverage, burning fuel and time on every landing. The 40th Army's internal assessment from October 86 uses the phrase operationally unsustainable. Their phrase. The altitude mandate destroyed close air support overnight. A Hind pilot diving on a Mujaheddin position from 4,000 meters couldn't distinguish combatants from civilians at that range, couldn't place rockets within 200 meters of a requested target. The weapon that had pinned guerrilla forces in every engagement since 1979 now orbited uselessly above the effective ceiling of a 35-pound tube carried by a man on a mule. Soviet ground commanders in Paktia and Kunar provinces reported that air support requests went unanswered for days. Some units stopped requesting entirely. Loss rates tell the arithmetic. The 40th Army lost 23 aircraft to all causes in the 12 months before September 86. They lost 57 in the 12 months after. Stinger teams claimed roughly 270 kills through 1987, though CIA's own internal audit revised that figure downward to around 170 confirmed. Sources conflict on the exact number and probably always will. What nobody disputes is the ratio. Mujaheddin teams fired roughly 340 missiles in the first full year of deployment. Even the conservative count gives a kill rate above 50%. The SA-7's lifetime performance against Soviet aircraft in Afghanistan hovered around 3%. The smell of hydraulic fluid and aviation kerosene hung over crash sites, from Khost to Mazar-e-Sharif. Soviet recovery teams, the ones tasked with retrieving wreckage before the Mujahedin stripped it, started taking casualties themselves. Stinger operators learned to wait near burning helicopters because more helicopters always came looking. The 40th Army adapted, slowly, expensively, and nowhere near enough. The titanium exhaust shrouds arrived at Bagram in wooden crates that stank of machine oil and packing grease. Maintenance crews bolted them onto Mi-24D models through November of '86, working double shifts under floodlights, cursing the engineering drawings that didn't match the airframes they had. The shrouds mixed ambient air with engine exhaust before it left the nacelle, reducing the thermal signature by roughly 40% in the specific infrared band the SA-7 tracked. Against the Stinger's dual-band seeker, they accomplished almost nothing. Moscow's engineers knew this, or should have. The L-166 Lipa infrared jammer came next, a directional emitter mounted on the fuselage that pulsed, modulated infrared energy toward an incoming missile, attempting to confuse the seeker's tracking logic. The system weighed 86 kilograms installed. It drew power from the helicopter's already overtaxed electrical bus. Test results from the Chkalov, proving ground, showed effectiveness rates against dual-band seekers hovering around 12%. The 40th Army installed them anyway because doing something beat doing nothing, and because the Kremlin demanded visible progress on a problem that had no cheap solution. The flare cocktail changed 3 times in 6 months. First came mixed-spectrum cartridges that burned across a wider frequency range. 2-stage flares with delayed ignition followed, meant to simulate a receding heat source. Last were parachute-retarded flares designed to hang in the air longer, giving the missile more time to commit to the wrong target. Each iteration required new dispensers, new loading procedures, revised pilot training on deployment timing. Helicopter crews in Kandahar reportedly carried handwritten cheat sheets taped to their instrument panels listing which flare type to use against which threat bearing. The cheat sheets changed monthly. None of it solved the fundamental problem. The Stinger's rosette scan pattern compared the spatial profile of whatever it tracked against the background clutter surrounding it. A flare, any flare, presented as a shrinking point source falling away from the aircraft. An engine nacelle presented as a stable, distributed heat signature moving with an airframe. The missile's analog processor made this distinction faster than any pilot could punch a countermeasure button. Doctrine shifted too. Attack helicopters began flying in pairs with dedicated suppression aircraft. One Hind making the gun run while a second orbited high, watching for launch signatures, ready to roll in on the firing position with rockets. The tactic burned twice the flight hours, twice the fuel, twice the maintenance cycles and spare parts for the same number of strikes. And it assumed the suppression pilot could spot a Stinger launch in time. A man standing in scrub brush firing a 5-foot tube produces a brief puff of gray smoke from the ejector charge. The sustainer ignites 8 meters downrange. By the time the smoke clears, the missile travels at Mach 2 and the shooter has dropped behind a rock. Soviet Special Forces, Spetsnaz teams from the GRU's 15th Brigade received orders to hunt Stinger teams on the ground. Ambush the ambushers. They ran these operations through 87 and 88 with mixed results. A few teams got captured along with their missiles. The operations file from one raid near Rawalpindi lists 4 Stingers recovered intact. But the CIA pipeline delivered 900 to 1,000 units over the program's lifetime. Recovering 4 tubes while losing the helicopter that inserted the recovery team, which happened at Rawalpindi, defined the exchange rate Moscow faced. General Boris Gromov, who took command of the 40th Army in '87, later acknowledged that no technical countermeasure fielded during the war reduced Stinger effectiveness below what he called an operationally significant threshold. He chose those words carefully. What he meant, and what every pilot who flew in Afghanistan after September '86 understood in their hands and their gut, was that taking off meant accepting a coin flip on whether you'd land. American engineers in Pomona, California, had built a $600,000 missile that made a multi-million-dollar helicopter a liability. The math never balanced. The Soviet Union did not lose Afghanistan because of a missile. That's the comfortable version. The truth runs closer to this. The Soviet Union lost Afghanistan because a missile made every other problem unsolvable. Ground operations in Afghanistan depended on air superiority the way a body depends on blood pressure. Without helicopters flying low-level fire support, infantry columns stalled in ambush corridors. Without helicopter resupply, forward outposts ran dry on ammunition within 48 hours. Without medevac, wounded soldiers bled out in positions their commanders couldn't reinforce overland because the roads belonged to the Mujaheddin after dark. The Stinger didn't just kill helicopters. It severed the connective tissue holding the 40th Army's operational concept together. Look at the garrison reports from Coast in early '87. The base received an average of 14 helicopter resupply flights per week through August of '86. By March of '87, that number dropped to 3. Ground convoys picked up the slack, crawling through the Gardez Coast Corridor, a 90-kilometer stretch of road that Mujaheddin commanders had mined, ambushed, and contested for years. A convoy that once served as a secondary logistics option became the primary lifeline. The 40th Army lost more vehicles on that road in '87 than in the previous 2 years combined. Gromov understood the arithmetic. He'd commanded a motor rifle division in his first Afghan tour and knew what happened to units cut off from air support in mountain terrain. They died in place or they withdrew. There existed no third option. His planning staff began drafting withdrawal timelines in the summer of '87, months before the Geneva Accords gave the pullout a diplomatic wrapper. The Accords didn't cause the withdrawal. They decorated it. Most accounts of this period irritate me. They treat the withdrawal as a political decision made in Moscow, handed down through channels, executed by the military. That framing inverts reality. Gromov's operational reporting through '87 reads like a man building a case for retreat one data point at a time. Sortie rates declining. Fuel consumption per effective mission tripling. Pilot retention collapsing as experienced aviators rotated home, and replacements arrived with fewer flight hours in theater-relevant conditions. Meanwhile, the maintenance backlog on Mi-24s grew so severe that airframes sat grounded for weeks waiting on parts from Tashkent. The field drove the politics. Moscow ratified what Jalalabad and Bagram and Kandahar had already decided with their feet. The cordite smell of the last major Soviet offensive, Operation Magistral, in November '87, hung over the Gardez Coast corridor for weeks. Gromov threw everything he had at reopening that road. 3 motor rifle divisions, massed artillery, fixed-wing strikes from Su-25s flying above Stinger ceiling at 6,000 meters, dropping unguided bombs with accuracy that ranged from poor to criminal. The operation succeeded tactically. The road opened, convoys rolled through. Then the 40th Army pulled back to its bases, and the Mujaheddin reoccupied every position within 72 hours. Magistral cost the Soviets over 100 casualties to temporarily secure a road they'd controlled without effort 3 years earlier. That's what the Stinger did. Not by itself, never by itself, but as the catalyst that turned a difficult occupation into an impossible one. On February 15, 1989, Boris Gromov walked across the Friendship Bridge at Termez. The last Soviet soldier to leave Afghanistan, or so the official narrative claimed. He walked alone for the cameras, his son waiting on the Uzbek side, the whole scene choreographed for Soviet television. Behind him, the 40th Army's equipment convoys had been crossing for weeks. Tanks on flatbeds, trucks loaded with whatever couldn't be abandoned, APCs chained to rail cars, helicopters flying north in formations that hugged the border at altitudes their pilots would have considered absurd 4 years earlier. The bridge smelled like diesel exhaust and river water. Gromov made a short statement to reporters on the far side. He said the Soviet Army had fulfilled its internationalist duty. Every word of that sentence performed work opposite to its meaning. The internationalist duty had killed 15,000 Soviet soldiers, wounded 54,000 more, and consumed roughly 45 billion rubles that the Soviet economy, already hemorrhaging from energy price collapse and structural rot, could not spare. The Stinger didn't cause all of that, but without it, the war remained ugly and expensive and manageable. With it, the war became a wound that wouldn't close. Charlie Wilson watched the withdrawal coverage from his office in the Rayburn building, bourbon in hand. He'd spent 5 years steering money and weapons through congressional back channels to make this moment happen. Avrakotos had already left the agency by then, pushed out over internal politics. The missile cost $600,000. The empire it helped bring down had stood for 70 years, $53 million. That's what CIA spent between 1990 and 96 trying to buy back the Stingers it had handed out for free. The buyback price ran between $50,000 and $150,000 per unit, a discount on the original cost, a premium on the desperation. Agency officers fanned out across Pakistan's tribal areas and into Afghanistan itself, carrying cash in briefcases that smelled like old leather and sweat, negotiating with warlords who understood supply and demand better than most economics professors. They recovered fewer than a third. The rest scattered. Some ended up in Iran. The Revolutionary Guard acquired an unknown number through Mujaheddin factions with flexible loyalties. Others surfaced in Qatar, in Sudan, in places the Operations Directorate preferred not to discuss in congressional testimony. The battery coolant units had a 10-year shelf life, which meant the missiles remained functional into the mid-90s. After that, the seekers degraded. Probably. The CIA's own proliferation assessment from 94 hedges on this point, with language so cautious it borders on useless. But the damage wasn't really about missing Stingers. Every military planner on Earth watched what happened in Afghanistan and drew the same conclusion. A disciplined team with a shoulder-fired missile could deny airspace to a superpower. The Stinger didn't invent that idea. The SA-7 had proven the concept in Vietnam and the Yom Kippur War. What the Stinger proved was that the concept scaled, that it could determine the outcome of a war. Manpad proliferation became a growth industry through the 90s. The Chinese built the QW-1. The Russians upgraded to the Igla-S. The French sold Mistrals to anyone with a defense budget. By 2001, An estimated 500,000 shoulder-fired missiles existed worldwide in the inventories of over 100 countries and an unknowable number of non-state actors. That 5-foot tube, Engineer Ghaffar shouldered in a streambed near Jalalabad, became a template. One detail goes nowhere, but I can't leave it out. The Stinger's first confirmed kill in Afghanistan happened on the same day the Soviet Politburo's Internal Commission on Afghan War Costs delivered its quarterly report to Gorbachev. Pure coincidence. The Commission's report remains classified. The kill does not. Wilson died in 2010. Avrakotos in 2005. Ghaffar's whereabouts after 1988 appear in no file the agency has declassified. The records skip from his after-action reporting in late '86 to nothing. The engagement on September 25, 1986 sits in CIA's Directorate of Operations Archive under the Cyclone program files. The after-action report cataloged it as 3 FIM-92 engagements, 3 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties, all assets recovered. File reference redacted. Classification level. Top secret, sensitive compartmented information. Distribution restricted to 7 offices.